So welcome everybody to another wonderful lecture within the Psychological Humanities and Ethics series here with the Boston College Lynch School of Education and Human Development. My name is Tyga Gutierrez, and I'll be moderating our conversation today. And when I think of this community, this space that you all are a part of and being invited to today, I think many of us have this desire and hope and even a hunger for these conversations of ethical enrichment for the moment of the world we live in today, and the ways in which psychology is really vastly enriched by philosophy and theology and these other disciplines. And as I was reading the news, even this morning, I was reflecting upon the ways in which our society seems so much more divisive and reactive than ever. And as I've worked with students or patients, this reactivity to the happenings in the world come with so much affective realities and dimensions that I think a lot of the time it's hard to know how to handle them and understand how these affective realities, the intricacies and complexities and how we are to respond to them. So I'm really excited today because we have two amazing people with us who I think you'll enjoy and learn from greatly as much as I've begun to in the correspondences and previews I've had from them. So today's lecture is titled Anger, Gaslighting, and Affective Injustice, and we'll be hearing from Dr. Shiloh Whitney and Dr. Jerome Veit. Dr. Shiloh Whitney is an associate professor of philosophy at Fordham University, a critical phenomenologist, and a feminist philosopher. Whitney is leading efforts to theorize affective injustice and emotional labor, and her published work on French thinkers such as Merleau-Ponty and Fanon, titled Affective Intentionality and Affective Injustice, as well as From the Body Schema to the Historical Racial Schema. Both of these and more contribute to the emerging area of critical phenomenology by developing the phenomenological theory of the body schema into a theory of affect, and also by offering a critical phenomenology of emotional experience and affective influence. Our respondent today is Dr. Jerome Veit, and he is a senior adjunct professor of philosophy and psychology at Seattle University and a licensed therapist at Seattle Anxiety Specialists. His work bridges academic and clinical discourse, drawing on hermeneutics and critical phenomenology to address themes such as slow violence, social trauma, and relational conceptions of the unconscious. He's the author of Gadamer and the Transmission of History, and the translator of the Heidegger Reader and Gunter Fiegel's Aesthetics as Phenomenology. So please welcome both these amazing speakers. And today we will start with Shiloh, followed by a response by Jerome, and then we'll end with a Q&A session. So without further ado, welcome Dr. Shiloh Whitney.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Tyga. And thank you so much for the invitation to speak to this group. I think it's really, really interesting to be thinking about the intersection of philosophy and psychology. And I'm very excited to hear what y'all have to say about this work, this research. So let me go ahead and share my screen so that you can see the presentation that I brought for you today. The work that I'm going to talk about today is on anger gaslighting. It's research for my book on affective injustice. I'm going to start by just kind of orienting us to where I started with this project and where that led me. So I started with a phenomenon, the case of anger gaslighting. In garden variety gaslighting, you might be made to second guess your perceptions. In anger gaslighting, you're made to second guess your emotional response, your anger. So if gaslighting is a behavior that tends to make its target doubt herself, anger gaslighting is behavior that tends to make its target doubt herself about her anger. What does it mean to doubt yourself about your anger? Here's some of the first-person description that got me thinking about this. So Gloria Steinem, in an interview in 2018, says, I could finally tell people on a Thursday that I'd been angry on a Monday. I couldn't tell them in real time. Soraya Chemily writes, anger was so effectively severed from my use that instead of being a catalyst for change, feeling angry invalidated both my confidence and my own experiences. And Leslie Jameson, also in 2018, writes, for years, I described myself as someone who wasn't prone to anger. I don't get angry. I said, I get sad. At a certain point, I started to suspect that I was angrier than I thought. So I'll remind you of this testimony in the next section. But for now, I'm hoping that this gives you a feel for what anger gaslighting is like. I'm hoping that when we hear this testimony, you suspect, as I did, that there's something going on there that needs a name, that we need concepts for talking about this. Gaslighting in general is something that currently is being discussed in feminist philosophy as an epistemic injustice, an injustice related to knowledge and credibility. And gaslighting, of course, has this really interesting history as a concept. It comes from that 1944 Ingrid Bergman film, and it made it into sort of vernacular discussions about abuse in interpersonal relationships, made it into clinical psychology, clinical psychological case studies, thinking about interpersonal abuse. But more recently, it's been taken up as a term for a phenomenon that can be part of a broader social injustice. So there's been this pivot both in the vernacular and in academic conversations about gaslighting to thinking about its role as part of social injustices. And that conversation in feminist philosophy about gaslighting as an epistemic injustice is a key part of what's going on with that in philosophy. So yeah, thinking about gaslighting here in feminist philosophy, it's thought about in terms of the conversation about epistemic injustice, where epistemic injustices are injustices that are related to knowledge and to credibility. I wanted to intervene in that conversation and argue that gaslighting can be an affective injustice, an injustice that's related to emotions and to affective influence. So my modest goal when I started thinking about anger gaslighting was just to argue that gaslighting can be not just an epistemic, but an affective injustice by thinking through that phenomenon of anger gaslighting as a paradigm case. So just to put that on our map there, anger gaslighting seemed like a good case for bringing out that larger affective dimension that gaslighting, I thought, participated in. But underneath that, I had this more ambitious agenda. It sort of started to grow. I think I started to realize that I wanted to study anger gaslighting as a phenomenon that could put us in touch with affective injustice more broadly, beyond anger, to other episodic emotions, beyond gaslighting. I think that there is this whole dimension of injustice that operates in our affective responses to each other. And as I got further into thinking through that anger gaslighting case, I realized that studying anger gaslighting could be a route to crafting some concepts that could give us purchase on that whole affective dimension of injustice and enable us to think about it and to talk about it. In particular, as I was doing this work, what came out was that thinking through that anger gaslighting phenomenon led me to the concept of uptake. I'm going to have a lot to say about uptake today. Uptake is a second person affective behavior. It's not about how I feel, but about how I'm moved by somebody else's affective behavior. So I'm going to end up defining anger gaslighting behavior in terms of uptake. How do you gaslight someone about their anger? Well, you deprive it of uptake. And this notion of uptake became really fruitful. It allowed me to identify the category of uptake injustice. That's a category of affective injustices that concern giving or refusing uptake to other people's affects. And that allows us to identify affective injustices beyond that paradigm case, beyond anger, beyond gaslighting. I'm not going to talk about emotions other than anger today. And so I have a little strike through on that part of the slide because we're going to stick to anger, but we will look a little beyond gaslighting. And there are a variety of other uptake-related concepts that kind of came out of this work that are fruitful for getting a purchase on affective injustice. And we'll talk about those in due time in the talk. And I really hope that they're useful to you, whether it's in your research or as tools for clarifying your experiences or discussing them. As a philosopher, I think about myself as somebody who's a conceptual craftsperson. I'm trying to craft concepts that are useful tools for others. And as a feminist philosopher and as a critical phenomenologist, I'm especially interested in gaps in our concepts that function to compound injustices, where we don't talk about a problem because it lives in marginalized experiences. And so our dominant discourse maybe doesn't have the terms to address it. And I really hope that these concepts that I developed out of thinking through this anger gaslighting case are useful in those ways. So just to put that on the map, I started with this phenomenon of anger gaslighting. That led me to the concept of uptake and this whole uptake-related category of affective injustice. So today what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce you to this phenomenon of anger gaslighting. I'm going to show you why I think that it matters. I'm going to develop the concept of uptake as a feature of that phenomenon. And I'm going to argue that uptake injustice is an important category of affective injustice. I'll demonstrate its usefulness in some other cases and sort of assess what we learn from this about affective injustice. The big takeaway then is going to be that uptake injustice is an important category of affective injustice. My goal today is to try and bring us to the point where not only can you sort of tune into and understand what I'm saying here when I talk about uptake injustice and find that compelling, and we can have a conversation not only about anger gaslighting, but also about affective injustice more broadly. All right, so anger gaslighting, what is it? What are we talking about here? So first, let's talk about the effect, that gaslighting effect. When a person is successfully gaslit, they're not only doubted by others, they begin to doubt themselves. So gaslighting is aimed at trying to get another not to take herself seriously. It's not just the sort of dismissal that doesn't take you seriously. It gets you not to take yourself seriously. And the way you do that, the way you get someone to doubt herself is by casting doubt on her. So that's the behavior that leads to it, casting doubt on someone. In the epistemic case, persistently casting doubt on the credibility of my testimony tends to make me second guess my experiences and my beliefs. In the affective case, persistently casting doubt on my emotional competency tends to make me second guess my affective responses. Notice that the effect is not only that my emotion doesn't move others appropriately, it's that my affective responses themselves might be impaired. So if anger is a response to insult or injury, then when anger gaslighting is successful, the spontaneity, the conviction, or the legibility of that response is impaired. So we remember the descriptions that I showed you at the top of the talk. I take those to be that, Gloria Steinem, I could finally tell people on Thursday I'd been angry on Monday, couldn't say it in real time. Soraya Chemily talking about how feeling angry invalidated her confidence in her experiences. Leslie Jameson saying, I don't get angry, I get sad, but then beginning to wonder if that is the right description of her experience. So I take these to be descriptions of the spontaneity or the conviction or the legibility of the person's anger response being impaired. And I'm hoping that the quotes give you a reason to think that that anger gaslight effect is real, is a thing, and that it's a feminist issue. Just for some citations here, these are 3 books that helped me to get in touch with that anger gaslighting phenomenon. They all came out in 2018. They're all about women's anger and the kinds of things that have been done to try and suppress it and how much it's accomplished in spite of that. So in this section, we should talk about why anger gaslighting matters. I want to try and give you some reasons to think that it does. First of all, I think that anger is very relevant in the contemporary world right now. I think anger gaslighting is this uniquely relevant case because anger is such urgently contested territory in our world at the moment. Whose anger is going to be taken seriously and direct our collective conversation toward its objects? And whose anger is going to be treated as a tantrum, to be contained, to be disciplined? Will it be the angers of insubordination, right? The ones that punch up? Or will it be those angers of aggrieved entitlement, the ones that punch down? Both of these abound in our social and political landscape and vie with each other. But I also think that anger and anger gaslighting matter in ways that aren't so contingent on the mood of the times. I think that anger has some unique moral and political functions. It enables us not just to register injustice, but also to take a forceful stand against it, both singly and collectively together. And anger gaslighting can lead us to doubt ourselves in ways that sabotage those functions. So what are those functions? Well, first of all, my anger orients me. It's a part of my moral perception. It has a function in my moral perception, just as fear is my sense of alarm and grief is my sense of loss. Anger is my sense of injustice. It's an important part of my moral compass. I mean that anger is a way for me to get my bearings in a situation, to focus and direct my attention, to make sense of what matters and how it matters. And in making me second guess my anger, anger gaslighting disorients my moral compass. And that makes it this uniquely powerful tool of subordination. Also, I think that anger has a function that's part of moral motivation and action. So anger motivates action, but I think also anger is itself already an action. I think that anger makes demands. It takes a stand. It claims jurisdiction. So in denouncing wrongdoing in a wrongdoer, an angry response claims status. It demands respect. It takes on a degree of meaning-making jurisdiction in a shared situation. It occupies space in that way, meaning-making space. So anger gaslighting threatens our capacity to stand up for ourselves and for others in that way. I said that my anger orients me, right? It functions as a first-person sort of orientation. But my anger can also orient you. It functions as a second-person orientation as well. So anger has a function as a kind of moral and political influence. Anger is a way of directing and focusing attention. I think that anger broadcasts a kind of other-orienting influence, this attention-directing force. It conveys attention toward its object, the wrongdoing, toward its target, the wrongdoer. So my anger is a way for me to get my bearings, but it's also a way for you to get my bearings. My anger can sensitize you to what matters to me, to the affective geography of our situation, according to me. And it can do that in a way that's quite different from a dispassionate report. It doesn't just tell you what matters to me. It shows you. It gives you a feel for the world according to me. And I actually think that all episodic emotions can do this. And when I use the term affective influence, that's what I'm thinking about. Anger might be uniquely demanding about it, though. In any case, anger gaslighting is a tool for making anger's other-orienting function backfire, redirecting attention away from what I'm angry about and onto scrutiny of me and my emotional state instead. Because of these functions that anger has, these moral and political functions, and because of its unique scope as our sense of injustice, as Soraya Chemali writes, the dynamic of who gets to express anger matters in all unequal social relationships. I talk a lot about gender in the examples, but anger gaslighting is a powerful multi-purpose tool of subordination. Race, class, age, these are all sites of anger gaslighting, and they all ramify the ways that gender is a site of it. But ultimately, I think that's all the more reason to think that anger gaslighting is an important case in its own right, and that anger gaslighting is a uniquely instructive paradigm case for understanding how emotions can be weaponized in social power struggles. So hopefully that's given you some reasons to think that anger and anger gaslighting matter. For the sake of citations, these are some feminist philosophers who wrote about why anger matters and have been particularly influential for me. What I've said in this section reflects a contemporary conversation in feminist philosophy about anger's moral psychology, as we say, meaning its function in our moral apparatus. And that conversation is taking place in a different corner of feminist philosophy than the epistemic injustice one. It inherits this ancient debate in philosophy between Aristotle and Seneca about whether anger is always a vice or whether it can be a virtue. And it inherits a really interesting 20th century Western feminist discussion that's suspicious about how gender and racial hierarchies prejudice our practices of evaluating anger. And most of the contributions to that current conversation are interested to exonerate anger, at least to some extent, by articulating its moral psychology, its function as part of our moral apparatus, especially for people who live in circumstances of social injustice. So what I've said in this section reflects some consensus in that conversation. Where it has my own spin on it, that usually comes from the way that I'm influenced by phenomenological thinkers, especially Merleau-Ponty and Fanon. And we can talk about all of that in the Q&A period if you want to hear more about it. But so what we've talked about now is sort of what the effects of anger gaslighting look like and why they matter. What does the behavior that causes anger gaslighting look like? How are we going to recognize it? How are we going to identify it? Well, here are two descriptions. Alicia Garza, in an interview in 2018, says, Black women's anger gets dismissed and devalued and gaslighted. We get told all the time that our anger is disruptive, that it's a distraction, that it's divisive, that it's moving us backwards, yet nobody ever seems to question, why are you so fucking mad? 35 years earlier, Marilyn Frye writes, it's a tiresome truth of women's experience that our anger is not generally well received. Attention is turned not to what we are angry about, but to the project of calming us down and to the topic of our mental stability. It's as common as dirty socks. Our anger is deprived of uptake. So the behavior that they're describing is very similar, despite the 35 years between them. And this is what it is. Anger gaslighters don't pay attention to what I'm angry about. Instead, their attention gets stuck on my emotional state. They cast doubt on whether I'm regulating my emotions properly. Anger gaslighters are insensible to my anger's demands on their attention. They might be moved by my anger, but they're moved in the wrong direction in a way that disables my anger's functions rather than enabling them. And Marilyn Frye calls this depriving anger of uptake. So uptake, we said, was this, just to put a definition up, was this second person affective phenomenon. It's not about how one feels oneself, but about how one reacts to somebody else's affective behavior. And we have two different variations. Uptake can be given and uptake can be refused. In general, giving uptake directs your attention onwards through my anger toward what I am angry about and why. My anger orients you to what matters to me in the situation. Refusing uptake, on the other hand, backfires my anger's attention directing force. So instead of being moved to attend to my anger's object, your attention gets stuck on my emotional state, on the anger itself. So just looking a little more closely at what that means, giving uptake means that you've cooperated with my anger enough for it to fulfill its function. It's conveyed that attention directing force. It's given you my bearings on the situation. Giving uptake doesn't require you to capitulate to my anger. It does require you to allow my anger to direct and focus your attention and perception. Giving uptake means you've tuned in to my concerns. You've become sensitized to what matters to me. I think Frye's example is really helpful here. She talks about what happens when you walk off with the hammer that I'm using and I respond angrily. So in this situation, giving uptake doesn't require that you give the hammer back necessarily. But it does require that you become sensitized to the web of meanings that forms the affective geography of the situation for me. My anger isn't just an outburst that can only inform you about my emotional state. It's a thread that you can trace outwards, sensitizing you to my projects, my interests, my attitudes, concerns, the way they populate our situation. The hammer is woven into that web. And my anger, when you walk off with it, is the stickiness of my web of meaning still tugging on the hammer, still tugging on you now, a thread of my web that you can trace back or you can brush off. Giving uptake requires that you respond to my anger in a way that follows that thread. And that as you weave your own web of meanings in the situation, you contend with mine, right? You stay in touch with them, you feel their weight. So uptake in the hammer example, it could involve apologizing and returning the hammer. Oh my goodness, I didn't realize you were using it. I'm so sorry. Or it could involve insisting that you have a prior claim to the hammer, right? I was already working with it. Or maybe that your project is more urgent than mine. Maybe I was building a birdhouse and you're shuttering the windows in advance of an oncoming hurricane. Either way, when you give uptake to my anger, you lend to my anger your own affective capacities, your interest, your concern, your curiosity, your feel for the situation. You allow my anger to express itself through you, through them, through your affective capacities, and to populate your own feel for the situation with my anger's concerns and with how they vie with your own. Let's talk a little about refusing uptake in a bit more detail. So refusing uptake disables my anger's functions. When you refuse my anger uptake, you brush it off as if it's a mere nuisance, as if it's an outburst that reflects my agitation, a sort of disturbance inside me, but doesn't bear on anything in the world that we share. Refusing uptake can take a lot of forms, right? When you take the hammer that I was using and I respond angrily, refusing uptake might be just sort of dismissive, ignoring me. Maybe you roll your eyes or give a long-suffering sigh. Maybe you're perfectly placid and indifferent. It might take the form, refusing uptake, of pulling rank, right? How dare you speak to me in that tone? It might be openly hostile, right? You snap at me, you tell me to shut up, maybe you punish me or even violently subdue me if I press on. But it might also present itself in much more benevolent forms. So it might present itself as flattery, right? You take my hammer and I respond angrily, and you smile and you tell me I'm so cute when I'm mad. And then if I get mad at that, you tell me I can't take a compliment, right? This would be refusing uptake, but in the form of flattery. It might take the form of maddening forms of benevolence, right? I can see that you're very upset, or I'm so sorry that you feel that way. And those responses, they might seem cooperative, but admiration, emotional validation, no matter how sincere, those aren't a substitute for uptake. At this point, it's interesting to ask whether refusing uptake is sometimes appropriate, and I do think that it is. Sometimes our emotions are inapt. Our emotional competencies can be miscalibrated, can be impaired, can be undercultivated, can be biased. And it's not clear that uptake is appropriate in those cases. Refusing uptake treats my anger like it's a tantrum or an outburst, and that can be injurious, as the phenomenon of anger gaslighting shows, right? Whether or not our anger receives uptake can over time miscalibrate it. But tantrums and outbursts are real things. They do happen. Famously among not only children, but also tyrants. And if the angry person is young, if their affective competencies aren't yet developed, if they've been impaired in those emotional competencies, either by oppression or by privilege or by circumstances in general, what's the just and caring response? What sort of uptake work might be needed, not only to avoid injuring each other's emotional competencies, but to cultivate them or to counteract circumstances that might impair them? And I don't have the answer for this right now or in this talk. I do think that it might not be as simple as just giving versus refusing uptake to the anger. I think we might have to explore the space in between and learn how to give uptake not only to the anger as expressed, but to the affective sense-making agency of the person and to the circumstances that might be impairing it. But perhaps the most urgent observation about good uptake refusal is that if anger's moral and political functions can be impaired, not only by deficits of uptake, but potentially also by surpluses of uptake, then giving uptake to inapt anger could do a lot of damage. And I think that does happen often with those angers of aggrieved entitlement, with the anger of tyrants. We sometimes fail to question the emotional competency of powerful people, even when we should. Right? In those angers of aggrieved entitlement, your moral compass is in fact miscalibrated. Right? Entitlement has made you experience a demand for equality as if it's marginalization. Your sense of injustice is firing, but it's misfiring. In any case, I think that uptake helps us to specify precisely what anger gaslighting behavior is. Anger gaslighting behavior is persistent, pervasive refusal of uptake for apt anger. Okay, so now we have this concept of uptake, and that's helped us to clarify what anger gaslighting behavior is. I want to move outward from that and demonstrate that uptake injustice is bigger than anger gaslighting. I want to do some of that work that sort of thinks through this category that we got out of the anger gaslighting case and tries to reach larger toward that larger category of affective injustices. And that's actually going to end up opening up a possibility for grounding the account of this, of anger gaslighting, as unjust. What's unjust about affective injustice and uptake injustice in particular? So we remember our diagram, uptake injustice, I think, is bigger than anger gaslighting. So if uptake is a scalable category of affective injustice that has purchase beyond the anger gaslighting cases, then I should be able to identify uptake injustices that concern anger, but exceed gaslighting. So there on our map, we have some anger-related uptake injustices that exceed the case of anger gaslighting, and indeed that exceed gaslighting. Also, I should be able to identify some uptake injustices that concern other emotions. I've thought a little about fear and grief. I'm beginning to think about joy or happiness. I'm really interested in thinking through generosity and gratitude, but I'm not going to talk about other emotions today. So let's instead stick with anger, but think beyond gaslighting. So thinking in terms of uptake refusal as how we're going to characterize the behavior in the anger gaslighting case allowed me to identify some uptake injustices that are caused by anger gaslighting behavior, even when it doesn't succeed in producing that full-on gaslighting effect. So I think that persistent uptake refusal for apt anger can cause some more finely grained varieties of uptake injustice, even if the target is able to resist those strong anger gaslighting effects and never actually doubt herself about her anger. So I'm going to talk about anger swallowing and also about anger muting and backfiring, which are related. So anger swallowing, we often adapt to uptake refusal by swallowing our anger in anticipation of it. And that's a byproduct of anger gaslighting behaviors. But what's unjust about it exceeds the tendency to gaslight. This is an interesting case because I think anger swallowing is an adaptive response to a non-choice-worthy situation. It may not be intrinsically injurious, although Amiya Srinivasan seems to think that it is. There's a paper on the aptness of anger where she's thinking about a case and suggests some reason to think it might be intrinsically injurious to have to swallow your apt anger. But in any case, frequently swallowing apt anger can become toxic even if its target never doubts herself about her anger. Soraya Chemily collects some really interesting research on the kind of literal toxicity of this, of having to frequently swallow apt anger. Audre Lorde has some really interesting things to say about the moral injury of it, the way that frequently swallowing apt anger can result in this toxic excess of anger that erupts onto ill-fitting objects and harms relationships and community. She talks about swallowing so much apt anger at injustice that she begins, she says, to vomit out fury onto things I love. And that's injurious in a way that's distinct from the way that the anger gaslighting effect is. And it gives us additional reasons to think that the demand to swallow apt anger is unjust, and reasons to think that we might have some other more finely grained injustices that are going on here. So we can put anger swallowing on the map, but let's also talk about anger muting and backfiring. So uptake refusal sabotages anger's functions, even if the target never doubts herself about her anger. So refusing uptake mutes anger's influence, its capacity to orient ourselves and others and to put what matters to us on the map of others' attention and concern. And that's a direct result of anger gaslighting behaviors. But you might think that what's unjust about it exceeds the tendency to produce that full-on gaslighting effect. You're muting anger's influence. Uptake refusal may even make anger not only ineffective, but counterproductive. There's an interesting study that shows that when men conduct their arguments angrily, that increases their persuasive influence on others. When women made their arguments angrily in the study, it wasn't just that we sort of didn't have that bump, that sort of surplus of influence. Women making our arguments angrily actually decreased our persuasiveness with respect to women who made the arguments dispassionately. There was a deficit. So that's not just muting the anger. It's actually, sort of making its effects, making it ineffective. It's actually backfiring it. It's making it counterproductive. Rebecca Traister observes, anger works for men in ways that it doesn't for women. Men like both Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders can wage yelling campaigns and be credited with compellingly channeling the rage felt by their supporters, while their female opponents can be jeered and mocked as shrill for speaking too loudly or forcefully into the microphone. Another study showed that while men tend to experience anger as empowering, women tend to experience it as disabling. And perhaps we feel that way because it's true, because background conditions that are created by uptake practices have made anger a power that's afforded to men and a risk women have to avoid. Of course, anytime when we're talking about these studies, I think it's clear that race inflects this, and the studies that I'm citing here don't track that. They don't have an intersectional methodology for talking about these things. But like when Tracer is talking about Obama and Sanders vis-a-vis, sorry, Trump and Sanders, as opposed to Clinton. Remember, Barack Obama famously also couldn't expect anger to work for him. We remember the sketch with Keegan-Michael Key as Obama's anger interpreter. And interestingly, you know, I'm painfully aware that white women are often refused uptake for our anger, but also historically, I think there are lots of cases where white women have used anger very effectively and received uptake for it when we deploy it in favor of white supremacy, of patriarchy. Think about white moms angrily denouncing school desegregation. So I think we do need to attend really carefully to the intersectionality of these uptake injustices. But again, those are only more reasons, I think, to put them on our map. So I've put anger, muting, and backfiring on the map here, more anger-related uptake injustices that go beyond that original paradigm case of anger gaslighting. Now, once we put anger backfiring on our map, one of the things that I started thinking about is that it seems here that we have these deficits and surpluses of uptake for different social groups. And we might indeed, in some of those studies, the one about, you know, anger increasing the persuasive influence of men's arguments and decreasing it for women, there's an economy of uptake that's going on here that's producing these relative deficits and surpluses. Now, that's interesting because if that's true, then perhaps that economy of uptake and the relative deficits and surpluses of it can ground evaluations of affective injustice. Maybe we don't need to always appeal to aptness as opposed to inaptness to ground our evaluations of affective injustice. Maybe questions of injustice can be posed at the level of the uptake economy. They arise where there are large-scale patterns of inflating the affective influence of one class of people at the expense of deflating that of another class in a manner that's complicit with social hierarchies. So what I'm interested in there is the way that we're seeing how the affective injustice at stake in anger gaslighting behavior is not only unjust because it deprives apt anger of uptake and because it tends to cause that injurious anger gaslighting effect, but perhaps we can also ground that claim that anger gaslighting behavior is unjust because it reproduces deficits and surpluses of anger uptake and makes anger enabling for one social group and disabling for another in a manner that's complicit with social hierarchies. It renders anger a power one social group is afforded, even as it renders it a risk or even directly self-undermining for another social group. So we've learned something about a large category of affective injustice and what makes it unjust. Uptake injustices are constituted by deficits and surpluses of uptake, which may be deficits and surpluses relative to some evaluation of aptness. It got less uptake than it deserved on its own terms, that episodic emotion. But they might also be deficits and surpluses relative to each other. One social group is getting a surplus of uptake, and another is getting a deficit of uptake, not because it's too much in objective terms, but because we can see that deficit and surplus relative to each other in the broader uptake practices, in some way that's complicit with reproducing a social hierarchy. So let's talk just a little bit more about uptake surpluses. Anger gaslighting involves an uptake deficit, but we also have uptake surpluses. Uptake can be unjustly given and not just unjustly refused. And as an example of this, I'm going to talk about Kate Mann's notion of himpathy. She says, I define himpathy as the inappropriate or outsized sympathy extended to male perpetrators of misogyny and sexual violence over their female victims, who are often erased in the process. Himpathy means worrying about his bright future and not her suffering. You see that deficit and surplus going on, that bidirectional uptake injustice. And that's what empathy is, I think, in the terms that I'm developing here. It's a bi-directional uptake injustice, unjustly giving uptake to the anger, distress, and fear of powerful men who get caught harming women, and unjustly refusing uptake to the anger, distress, or fear of women they harm. Empathy is going to produce gaslighting as one of its effects, but it's unjust in an additional way. And we might think about a companion term to anger gaslighting. I say here anger coddling. I'm not completely attached to that term. You might have a better one. But in any case, if anger gaslighting behavior is the persistent, pervasive refusal of uptake for apt anger, anger coddling behavior is the persistent, pervasive uptake giving for inapt anger. But again, we may not need to establish aptness versus inaptness in every case to ground the judgment that empathy is an affective injustice. Its bidirectional character reveals an uptake economy that creates deficits and surpluses of uptake. So if that uptake economy is complicit with a social hierarchy, then that's a way to specify what makes it count as an affective injustice, in particular an uptake injustice, in a way that doesn't rely on being able to distinguish aptness and inaptness of each emotional episode. So those relative deficits and surpluses in a broader economy of uptake can ground those evaluations of affective injustice. And you might here consider a parallel to Miranda Fricker in the epistemic injustice conversation, her appeal to a credibility economy in her account of testimonial injustice. My testimony could be false, but still suffer testimonial injustice given the way that deficits and surpluses in the economy of credibility inflected how my testimony was received. So we can talk about testimonial injustice in a way that isn't always tied to, isn't always grounded in considerations about whether the testimony was in fact true or false in each case, because we can think about those deficits and surpluses in the credibility economy. And I'm making a similar move here. I think that it's interesting to ask questions about deficits and surpluses in the uptake economy of other emotions and what's at stake in that. I think we can extend the account of uptake injustice in that direction, but I'm not going to do that today. So just to recap what we covered in this section, anger gaslighting behavior produces uptake injustices even when it fails to gaslight. We had that anger swallowing, anger muting, and backfiring. Anger gaslighting involves uptake deprivation, but uptake injustices can involve surpluses as well as deficits, since we talked about empathy for that. And relative deficits and surpluses in the economy of uptake can ground our judgments of affective injustice. So uptake injustice goes beyond gaslighting, and it's this valuable category for understanding affective injustice beyond the paradigm case, and even for grounding what's unjust about it. So I do have one last section here. I'm going to try and go through it quickly. I think it's interesting to go through this one because it has a little bit more of an interest in remedies and responses to this sort of injustice. So I'm going to propose a concept of uptake rules to describe the conditions that produce affective injustices like anger gaslighting at a structural level. And I want to think about the methodological importance of uptake in this section, not only for studying affective injustice, but also as this uniquely affective variety of agency that we have to intervene in affective injustices like anger gaslighting. Okay, so uptake rules. Sociologists talk about feeling rules. Those are social norms and expectations that prescribe first-person affective behavior, which emotions are appropriate to feel, toward whom, when, with respect to what. The feeling rule, you're supposed to be happy at the wedding and sad at the funeral, etc. Studying uptake suggests we should introduce a more finely grained category of feeling rules. Uptake rules, so social norms and expectations that prescribe uptake, that second person affective behavior, whether it should be given or refused and when and toward whom, etc. If uptake injustices like anger, gaslighting, and empathy aren't only isolated cases of interpersonal abuse that we should look at the scale of each relationship, etc., but actually operate in a structural way. as a set of background conditions that tend to produce injurious effects for particular social groups, then it must be because there are uptake rules that demand uptake in accordance with social hierarchies and condition whether and how the attention directing force of our affects finds purchase in others. And those uptake rules could function as these background sense-making conditions. They could kind of bake those uptake injustices like anger, gaslighting, empathy into the background conditions of our lives so that they can be influencing how we respond to each other's affects without the deliberate intent of the individuals involved. So, back to the hammer example, when I angrily demand my hammer back from you and you just smile and say, I'm cute when I'm mad, that might be influenced by uptake rules that are operating in the background, right? Prescribing the domains in which women's anger should be granted uptake. Maybe anger on behalf of our construction projects was not included in the purview of women's anger. So the feeling rules and uptake rules might correspond to certain kinds of emotional work. Sociologists think that feeling rules function as a demand for a certain kind of emotional work. We manage our emotions to induce or suppress the relevant feeling. You work up some happiness at the wedding. You work up some sadness at the funeral. Studying uptake suggests we should introduce a new category of emotional work. Uptake rules function as a demand for a different kind of emotional work, managing our attention to give or to refuse uptake. So this is interesting. Marilyn Frye says, and this is the place where I think she's getting interested in the deficits and surpluses of uptake too. She says that tracking anger uptake patterns is, she uses this really interesting phrase, an instrument of cartography. If we track whose anger gets uptake from whom with respect to what domain, et cetera, that's going to expose tacit uptake rules. That's going to yield a map of social hierarchies. And that's a fascinating claim. It makes anger uptake this powerful instrument for tracking complex intersections of power and for tracking affective injustice. But I think that we can draw a bolder conclusion even than Frye does here. I think mapping power is important, but we can do even more with uptake, because I think that uptake doesn't just map power. It shapes that territory. It raises the mountains, it lowers the valleys, not all on its own, but my point is that uptake has a constitutive role, not just a representational or indicative one. I think that giving or refusing uptake is an instrument not only of cartography, but of power. It's one of the ways that those social hierarchies are made. It doesn't just map them, it's also playing a role in making them. But putting together that account of uptake rules and uptake work with the constitutive power of uptake, that also indicates this uniquely affective agency that we might have to intervene in those affective injustices. So I think that uptake work then can be this site of affective activism, just as we can break feeling rules. So the anger of subordinates at those placed above them is this act of insubordination. Similarly, we can break uptake rules. So refusing uptake to those angers of aggrieved entitlement and giving uptake to the angers of insubordination, that's also an act of insubordination. And insubordination is always risky, and its effectiveness, as well as its whatever other incentives, it's not distributed evenly, the risks and the effectiveness of it. So I'm not suggesting that we should undertake that sort of insubordination without circumspection or as a panacea to all of our ills. But I think that there's a certain type of emotional work, uptake work, that's this important site of political struggle, this uniquely affective variety of agency that we can deploy. And I'll finish with this. There's an interesting read that I want to give of Sarah Ahmed's Feminist Killjoys as doing this sort of affective activism, the uptake and subordination. So the feminist killjoy who refuses to join in the laughter at a racist joke, at a sexist joke. Ahmed thinks about them as smile strikers in this Shulamith Firestone sort of tradition, refusing to do first-person emotional work, breaking the feeling rules that demand working up happiness at the common object of happiness, the sexist joke. But I think they're also uptake refusers. The feminist killjoy is also refusing that second person emotional work, breaking uptake rules that demand giving uptake to other people's happiness. And that means that they're using their affective influence, not just to say, that joke isn't funny, but to make it not funny, to actually kill the joy, to backfire the joke's affective force. All right. So I hope that I've given you some reasons to think ultimately that uptake matters methodologically, not just for studying affective injustices like anger, gaslighting, doing that mapping work, but also for remedying them. And hopefully I've convinced you that uptake injustice is an important category of affective injustice. And I think that I will stop there. Please do get in touch with me and let me know if these concepts are interesting for you, if they're tools that are useful for you in your work, in your life. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Shiloh. Thank you for a very clearly structured and just beautifully illustrated talk. I want to start off just by mentioning how grateful I am that you and others are developing this terminology to do this cartography. I really like the metaphor of charting a territory here, and I think in that regard, this is a great example of critical phenomenology at its best. And I want to quote a passage from Lisa Gunter's definition of critical phenomenology that I think just really captures what we've heard today, which is a way of making otherwise inchoate but powerful feelings available for further scrutiny, not just as a process of individual introspection, but as a collective practice of critical interrogation and social change. So you don't need to convince me. I think your ambitious goal, as you put it, of gaining purchase on affective justice more generally, you fully succeeded at that. I mostly just want to highlight in what follows some resonances that I heard, and some things that, I think are percolating for me, at least between the lines and behind the scenes of this. So by and large, I'm grateful that what you're doing here is naming and elucidating these all too common experiences of injustice, but also naming them as injustice. I think it's in the realm of speaking of emotion, writing about emotion, and the study of emotion. It's still all too common to slide into the talk of those as, on the one hand, biological responses, things that we just can't help but feeling, and thus they are outside the realm of any meaning or intentionality in the phenomenological sense. In other words, they don't have objects, or they get ranked as subjective, as merely internal, and as at most having an inner meaning to someone. And I'm grateful for work like yours and the work of all the people working at the intersection of phenomenology, of affect theory, psychology, psychoanalysis, to really unpack and unfold what emotion is, what this dimension of our experience is that has far too long and far too thoroughly been sidelined in any academic work, but especially in philosophy. So that's the bigger thrust I hear happening here, that I'm really, really grateful for. And more specifically, I think that the way you center affect in this mapping of injustice is just supremely helpful to me on multiple levels. I'm sure for the audience too, given that we come from different backgrounds, and I wear multiple hats as a teacher, as a therapist, as a scholar. I just found what you elucidated helpful in its pedagogical value. I mean, this is a talk. I look forward to the book version so that I can teach this. I think this is really something that deserves to be studied and taught, precisely because it orients us. It's about our orientation, of course, and the way our emotions orient us. But you're doing this work of orienting us with regard to that very territory. So from that perspective, wearing that hat, the pedagogical hat, I think this is brilliant work. And then I think from the clinical level, from wearing the therapist hat, my response would be something along the lines of, yeah, we stand to learn a lot from this theme of uptake injustice, affective injustice more broadly, because we're not trained in this. We're not trained in these terms, and we're not necessarily trained to pick up on precisely this justice dimension. I think all too often therapists are trained to or think that being a therapist means validating all emotion as emotion, or empathizing with emotion. And I'll say more on empathy in a minute that I heard happening here. So all that to say, from a high altitude standpoint, I love the mapping metaphor. I really appreciate even the visualization you gave with your Venn diagrams of how these things nest into each other. And so I think my starting point where I really want to hone in then is on this this therapeutic, from the therapeutic angle, honing in on this dimension of what uptake helps us to name, and how I think that concept is helpful. Because to me, what you've done is help trace out why it's important to engage in what may also be called something like witnessing in other literature. That's maybe a theme that others are acquainted with, certainly one that I've been drawn to. And I think your talk helps me understand why I've been drawn to that theme, not just as an epistemic witnessing of hearing testimony and hearing it as truthful, or hearing it as pointing to something that I see as well, but hearing testimony full stop, just hearing it, and hearing the testimony as pointing to something in the world, and not just someone else's world, but the shared world. And so that's a resonance I really picked up on here that might even answer Corinne's question in the Q&A of what the difference is between empathy and uptake. To me, you can of course answer what you would say, but to me, what I hear as the difference is empathy tries to feel what the other person is feeling, or tries to hear it from the other person's perspective, and as if I can erase my own. And as a hermeneutically trained therapist, I'm not sure one can do that. I'm not sure I can leave behind my standpoint and enter the others. But what I can do, and this is, I think, what uptake justice would be, is to hear the other's expression, whether that's of anger, of despair, shame, to hear that and understand, not just cognitively, but affectively, what that's pointing to, how that makes sense, and where in the world maybe that comes from. And this is really a point that another point that I heard you speaking to, which is that these affects are so frequently reactions to something. They're reactions to a prior condition, they're reactions to a state of affairs, or to a wound. And to treat them merely as a person's own reactions, of a person's dysregulation, is in some ways to negate or fail to take up that emotion in its orientation, in its pointing and in its very description of the state that that person's in. So to me, again, the resonances here from a therapeutic standpoint are really powerful to something like trauma, where especially in the case of complex trauma, or what I've come to think more of as, in my own terms, as wide trauma, something that isn't narrowly localizable, not easily put on that map. If we think of someone as reacting to something, we might be less tempted to urge them solely to regulate themselves. Not to say that they might not also need to find some way of soothing themselves, grounding themselves, caring for themselves. But so often in my training of future therapists and accompanying present therapists and sitting with clients, I sense how ineffectual or even counterproductive it can be to merely name the dysregulation and merely focus on what might be considered in clinical language coping strategies or self-care. These things are eminently important, and yet if we focus solely on them, we risk both occluding these larger influences and larger patterns of uptake injustice. And I also like that you brought in this theme there of toxicity, right? There's a real way in which the refusal of uptake, the denial or failure of uptake of someone's anger or any feelings induced by trauma, that those risk becoming toxic. And I know this might be a spin-off in a completely different direction, but that makes me think of Gabor Mate's work on trauma as a form of inflammation, or at least as connected deeply on the embodiment level with biological medical phenomena like inflammation. So I don't have the research. I don't work specifically into that dimension of trauma in my scholarship, but the theories abound as to the effects of something like, I think what you're calling anger swallowing or anger muting. One could imagine all sorts of other emotions that get swallowed and that someone is forced to hold on to precisely because there isn't an uptake of the indication, the pointing to where this is coming from or why one feels this way. As you so concisely put it, it's so often the refusal to see the pointing and instead the focus on the emotion itself, the person who's expressing the emotion, and the attempt to silence or gaslight that. So that's a context where I have witnessed that struggle, the struggle to take up, and from the client's perspective, the often really debilitating effect of something not being taken up, or the struggle on the part of the therapist to take something up, and the question to what extent one does that. And that's really, in my growth as a therapist, that's been an edge of needing to learn what might be therapeutic for that client, not just in the textbook sense of, okay, they need help regulating, or they need to get to the end of this day in a better state, but something more broadly hermeneutic of sharing a world and following the pointing, following where those affects point, and sharing maybe the naming of that injustice. If it's, for example, something of a complex and ongoing trauma, there would be a major injustice to not do that. I'm thinking here also of Jill Stauffer's work on what she calls ethical loneliness and the injustice of not being heard. There are a lot of resonances between your work, Shiloh, and I think the the work she's doing to trace out the layerings of testimony, and how testimony isn't just about factual epistemic witnessing, but about something more like this level of affective injustice and justice. I think that takes me to another maybe clinical angle, or an angle certainly from the realm of the clinical, which is this structural or systemic level. And I think if we think of the cartography terminology that you used, and the visualization of this, I suppose we could see that as a zoomed out perspective, in which it's not necessarily about this or that person refusing uptake to this or that other person, but rather something more like, as you call it, the uptake economy. I think that's a really helpful metaphor to really think of these things as patterns, as ripple effects between and among people, but certainly on something more like a collective level. And that just made me think of the work of people like Sally Weintraub, who work on the neoliberal backdrop to the climate crisis. And she has a book with a subtitle of, I believe, Neoliberal Exceptionalism and the Culture of Uncare. And it's that phrase, culture of uncare, that really resonated in the background for me as I was hearing you talk, of just how much we are made to sit with. All of us, certainly not in the same ways or to the same degrees, but we're all in a way made to sit with our own anger, our own frustrations, our own despair, our own sadness, precisely because there are so few avenues of expression that we can expect to be met with uptake. And certainly we might have that on the interpersonal level. We might have that on the level of a therapist or a partner or a friend, maybe a colleague. But do we have it at the level of the supervisor? Do we have that at the level of the job site, at the institutional level, at the local, regional, national political level? I think on many issues, at least, the resounding answer to that would be no, we don't. And that's another reason I think this terrain you're mapping and these terms you're giving this terrain are really helpful, because they help us at the very least name what it is we're missing, and name the experiences that we're called to. We are called to take up the expressions of others that deserve to be heard, and the pointing that deserves to be followed and traced. And I guess I'm thinking also of all the ways that I could situate myself in a map of affective injustice, and all the ways that I maybe fail to take up, and not as a way of justifying that, but as a way of situating that even further. I see that as a kind of nested circles, in that maybe I refuse to take something up because I don't trust that I can hold it, because I don't know if it'll be taken up if I express it elsewhere. Again, I don't say that as a way of taking off any responsibility, but rather to say there are structural layerings that you're pointing to here that I think help make sense of the sense of powerlessness that people have, the sense of voicelessness that people struggle with, and how that compounds the anger. That doesn't make it go away. It maybe forces people to swallow it. It maybe forces people to bottle it up until it explodes elsewhere. But I think it really helps us understand that rather than thinking of issues of justice as merely being about the content of the voices that are heard, or we need enough eloquent arguments, or we need to be more vocal in terms of what we stand for. That certainly may be the case. And yet, if we miss the affective layer of this, if we miss the dimension that when people are angry, that's a meaning. That isn't just a superfluous dimension, some layer that we can peel back and arrive at the meaning that is meaningful. And that's certainly something that has helped me in my training as a therapist and my work as a therapist. And I think it just resonates beyond that to a really broad societal dimension. So I think I'm going to pause there. There's just so much more I would love to talk about, and I'm just curious to to hear more questions and more unfolding of this. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Jerome and Shiloh, both of you for your wonderful conversation and discussion here. As questions come in and people are typing in more questions, we already have some here at the bottom of the Zoom screen, but I would also invite you to maybe share any immediate thoughts that maybe have come to your mind throughout this time, and as I'll go through the questions and pose them to you both.
Okay. Yeah, thank you so much, Jerome, for just those really, really generous, I think, that really generous response. It's so unbelievably worthwhile, not to mention rewarding, to hear someone else think through the way that just to hear you think through the way that this is fruitful in your own thinking, and that the way you look forward to it being fruitful in your work. That's just, it has such a, has such a profound effect on keeping me grounded in what these ideas are doing and can do in the world. And I really appreciate that. I'll just say I love that you your interest in kind of naming this as an injustice and really attending in some robust sense to this, to the affective dimension of injustice. I think it's easy to think about what we might mean by affective injustice as the sort of affective downstream effects of injustices, as if injustice is something that happens elsewhere. And of course, it makes us feel feelings, and those are kind of downstream effects that, yes, are important and we need to deal with, but the real action is happening elsewhere. And I think one of the things that is most important for me in thinking about this category of affective injustice, the reason why it grips me so much is because I think that the action is happening in the affective dimension sometimes, that our affects actually do things in the world and can be actually a mode of power. And I don't just mean power as domination, but also power as agency. Right? Our affective lives are a site of this unique kind of injustice that is actually constitutive of important injustices in the world. But also our affective lives are a site of uniquely affective kinds of agency that allow us to respond to and intervene in injustice. And I appreciate that you're making the connection, Jerome, between that and our theories of affects and emotions, our academic ones, and also our kind of folk theories of these things. How we understand or conceptualize what our affective lives, what our emotions are, matters. It's a theoretical question that really matters. I appreciate the also thinking through and really bringing out this point that there's something to the way that you talk about witnessing and use that concept, the way that we, for instance, hear someone's testimony. What matters about that, even though, testimony is an epistemic category, but what matters about that is not just epistemic. There's a way of tuning into someone else and sharing the world with them that's at stake there, that doesn't reduce down to whether you believe them or not, whether they got their message across or not. So I thought that was really interesting and really worthwhile.
Maybe that also relates to some of these questions that we have here. And this first one that Jerome kind of touched on a little bit, but that this uptake work is in some ways maybe related, but maybe differentiated from empathy. How do we kind of understand the differences there and the nuance?
Yeah, I really appreciate that question. I think it's important. And I mean, one of the reasons why it's important, I think, is because, I mean, I think there are interesting arguments for the importance of empathy. There are also suspicions of empathy. And so, so there are suspicious accounts. I mean, I'm thinking about Saidiya Hartman when I think about a kind of really pretty devastating critique of empathy as a way of responding to injustice. But yeah, so what's the difference between empathy and uptake? Thank you so much for this question. I think that we could talk about empathy, we could talk about sympathy. The meaning of those terms is sometimes a moving target. But in any case, I do want to distinguish uptake from two things, which we might call empathy, we might call sympathy, it depends. But there are two different things that I would want to distinguish it from. One is the thing that Jerome absolutely described, which is this sort of putting myself in somebody else's shoes. I actually don't think that uptake is primarily about putting myself in someone else's shoes. I think that there's a sort of triangular shape to uptake, right? So here's I'm angry at this, here I am with my anger and the object of my anger. And here's you as another point to that triangle. And we're not trying to collapse that triangle, right? So that you just put yourself in my shoes and you're feeling my feelings or your imaginative version of them, or however we might imagine that works. I think that in uptake, the triangle doesn't collapse, right? You're tuning in to my anger from your position, not from mine, right? You're tuning into my anger. You're letting it move your attention toward its object, and ultimately move your attention into, to sensitize your attention to that web of projects and interests and concerns that I have. But it's not as if you put off yours and take on mine. We're here sharing a world together. I like Jerome's account of the shared world as part of this too. We're positioned in the same space. We're sharing a space together, and your anger is moving me to attend to its objects. So it's not, uptake isn't you putting yourself in my shoes. And that's interesting because uptake is something that I think preserving that triangle is part of preserving the sense that when you get tuned into that web of meanings, that might challenge you in your position, right? Instead of just be this experience where you can sort of like be a tourist in my world. So I said I wanted to distinguish uptake from two things. One is the putting yourself in someone else's shoes. Another is the sort of parallel play of feeling anger along with me. Right. This is something that happens too. And I think we all know that this is a little maddening when it happens. So I'm angry at something, and you say, oh my goodness, I hate that too. Here I am, here's my experience of that. And now here I am telling my own stories. And now we're in this sort of parallel play mode where we're both angry at the same thing, or at least you think you're angry at the same thing I am. Maybe you're right, or maybe you're wrong about that. But in any case, you've reacted to my anger and gotten angry yourself. Now you're in your own intentional relation. You're not actually tuning into my anger and having your intentionality be sort of taught by it, oriented by it. How about the world according to me, and how that vies with the world according to you. So yeah, I would say whether we call them empathy or sympathy or something else, those are both things that I think uptake is not.
Thank you. Two comments and a question here. One is somebody from the audience saying, excellent conversation and research. They work with victims of narcissistic abuse who are constantly gaslit. And this work will validate their voices and spaces and systems that endorse abusers and devalue victims of gaslighting and other forms of emotional abuse. So just a thank you for this work. And this other comment maybe also relates to this next question, but it seems that these uptake rules that you were mentioning are also culturally bound. And I think of the ways in which, for example, the Japanese culture often emphasizes a certain suppression of affective discontent or anger in group settings to preserve a group harmony, for example. So kind of both of you having any thoughts within that? Well, also maybe I'll pose maybe a similar, in the same vein, a question from someone in our audience who asks, how do we recognize both the gendered and racialized, et cetera, nature of our response to anger, as well as the emanation of anger and work that also to legitimize these affects as objective reactions to defined events? They're kind of adding on that they personally academically see how, but suspecting that the culture won't, and therefore uptakes activist potential risks being thwarted by the need for that recognition for both of these.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to respond briefly to this question from the question that you just mentioned from Karine, I think, this one about how do we recognize the gendered or racialized nature of our response to anger? How do we recognize if there's some way in which our response to someone's anger is being shaped by some unjust set of uptake rules? How do I know that? And I think that's an absolutely fascinating question. I think it's really, really hard to tell on the scale of an episode whether that's happening. And I think it's difficult for the person who's responding, who's giving or refusing uptake and trying to figure out, wait, am I being complicit with some social injustice right now as I do this? I think it's also difficult for the person you're responding to, in this case, the sort of angry person who is being denied uptake or given it. And I think this is one of the structural features of all sorts of injustices that's really maddening, is that in any given episode, you can't tell, right? Like, I don't know whether my colleague was patronizing because of gender, right? In a way that's influenced by gender, or because they're just kind of a jerk and they were just being kind of mean that day, right? Like I don't know that. And it's part of what is so difficult about living in circumstances of injustice. And I think, as this person is thinking through, part of what is so difficult about living in circumstances of injustice and trying to remedy it, right? When you trying to respond to it in your own behavior. I think that one of the things that's really this business of thinking at the scale of uptake economies and thinking at the scale of justice itself is really important for how we recognize those gendered and racialized effects and try and correct for them in our behavior. I think we're not going to be able to just sort of introspect and look into our heart of hearts and find the moral corruption inside there and root it out, because I think that corruption exists at that larger scale. It's something that's in the air, it's in these background conditions, and we participate in it unless we actively are trying to correct for it. I think that these things actually live in the sort of background sense-making conditions of our world. And that's part of why it's so hard to root them out of your heart of hearts, because I think that's not actually where they live and thrive. So I think you have to think about it in a more outside-in way. I think that if you want to remedy it, you have to think about correcting for those larger patterns, noticing them when they're there and correcting for them. I'd love to hear what Jerome thinks about this stuff too. And I think that question about there being different feeling rules and different uptake rules, not only from one culture to the next, but also from one social group within a culture to the next. And interestingly, even within a given social group too, you find different feeling rules and different uptake rules depending on the context or who is concerned, right? Like there's a lot of differentiation there. And that's a really fascinating place to sort of push and ask questions. But I'd like to hear if Jerome has thoughts too.
I'm not sure we have enough time to fully flesh them out, but one phrase that came to my mind, Shiloh, as you were just talking and throughout this conversation, is a phrase from, I don't know if she coined it or not, but from a psychoanalyst, Jessica Benjamin, and the phrase is beyond doer and done to. So really pointing to what she calls the third. She's of course talking about psychoanalysis, but I think that can be scaled, as so much of the scaling that we can do with these things is to zoom out and see that it's often not about, like you said, this instance or that instance, or being able to say in those instances, oh, that's what's happening. We're really called to attend to the patterns, the structures, the experience over time of us, of others, and the relation between them. So that's in the relational psychodynamic tradition, but I think that meshes so powerfully with critical phenomenology, with hermeneutics, with whatever you want to call cross-cultural work or the name du jour. I think that's why we stumble to name those things, because it's not about this plus that culture. It's about the relation. It's about that third thing. And to me, that's been a perennial site of interest and curiosity. And that's just what I see you pointing us to, Shiloh, is just, there's a whole terrain to be explored there. And we shouldn't just be looking at emotion as subjectively experienced, or here's what that does to that person. But yeah, the triangular, what's it pointing to?
Well, thank you both. Yeah, go ahead.
Can I add to that too, because I think it's really interesting to this observation of like thinking beyond sort of doer and done to, and thinking to on this larger scale level, on the structural level of injustice. I think there's something really interesting to be pursued there about the way that this challenges are the way that thinking about structural injustices in general and how we identify them in the context of our lives, how we participate in them, and how we try to refuse participating in them. The way that stretches the usual ethical categories that we use of praise and blame, right? The doer and the done to there, the victim and the perpetrator. In so many cases, when it comes to structural injustices, those are not those aren't distinct subjects or persons. We're complicit in one injustice, even as we are the target of another. And I think that the ethical categories of praise and blame start to lose their immediate purchase. I think one of the things that can happen is we really want to search into our heart of hearts and root out the injustice there. We want to find the place where the moral corruption is inside of us, because we want to try and find a way to do right and not be blameworthy. But I think there's something interesting about recognizing that if we live in a world that is unjust and has these sort of features of structural injustice, we have to shift from just asking questions about praise and blame and come up with some different ethical categories for thinking about that, because we're going to always be participating in broader structural injustices that we're not, we didn't cause, but have some capacity to take responsibility for. Right? Even if we can't be blamed for them in that strict sense, maybe the right response is not always to try and have and remove ourselves from what is blameworthy, but to take this sort of more active response that's about taking responsibility for these things wherever we have the capacity to. So yeah, just a comment about how our ethical categories too sometimes don't always go as far as we need them to talk about these things.
Sadly, we're at the end of our time here, but this is such a rich dialogue. And so I just want to thank you on behalf of this community and those who are present here today for helping us to really think more humanely through conversing and encountering the whole person, really in their human identity, their suffering, and the potential with these ethical questions in mind. So Shiloh and Jerome, thank you so much for being with us. And for everyone else who was able to participate and ask questions, thank you for being here as well.
Many thanks to everyone who attended today and for these wonderful questions.